The energy for change in the world today, it feels electric, doesn't it?
It really does.
And it's hard not to notice that, well, a lot of that charge seems to be coming from Gen Z, born between roughly 1995 and 2010. This generation, they're stepping into adulthood facing, well, a whole confluence of really significant challenges.
Yeah, it's a unique set of circumstances.
Right? Climate change, deep-seated inequalities, social unrest. It's a lot. And it makes you wonder, how does their approach to making a difference, how does it stack up?
Absolutely. And to really get under the skin of this, we've been looking at some really fascinating sources. There's a great article from the BBC looking specifically at how Gen Z is changing activism.
Okay.
And then also two really comprehensive reports from the Pew Research Center. They give us a ton of data, lots of analysis on who Gen Z actually are, what they believe, and the kind of impact they're already having.
So our aim in this deep dive is pretty straightforward then.
Yeah.
We want to understand what's really driving Gen Z's activism. What makes their approach different from, what we've seen before? What are the core issues lighting that fire? And maybe the biggest question, how is technology shaping their methods and their reach?
Yeah, it feels like we're watching activism evolve in real time.
We are, and Gen Z is clearly a huge part of that story.
For sure. And it's striking how early some of this engagement starts. I mean, take Elijah Mackenzie Jackson. His story is quite something.
Oh, yeah. Tell me about him.
Well, his journey began with just like a concern for animal welfare. Led him to become vegetarian when he was only 10.
Wow, 10.
Yeah. And then by 14, that shifted to veganism because he started connecting it to the climate impact of food production.
I see.
And then boom, by 15, he's heavily involved. Climate strikes, working with groups like XR Youth, Fridays for the Future.
So he went all in, basically.
Totally. Now he's 18, planning to study sociology and fine art in New York after a gap year. But his path really shows this trend, Gen Z diving into activism really seriously and starting young.
Okay, so let's put this in context a bit.
Yeah.
Because youth activism itself, that's not exactly new, is it?
No, not at all. That's a really important point.
We can look back, right? The student protests in France in '68, the huge movement against the Vietnam War.
The civil rights movement.
Exactly. And even more recently, things like Occupy or the Arab Spring. Young people have always been a powerful voice for change.
That's the crucial historical backdrop. Young people have often been on the front lines. What feels different now with Gen Z, it seems to be how they do it.
The methods.
Yeah. The way they organize, how they communicate, how they mobilize support, it's just intrinsically tied to the digital world they grew up in. That seems to be a key differentiator.
And what a world they've grown up in. I mean, think about it.
Yeah.
Coming of age during the fallout from the 2008 recession,
The economic instability.
witnessing this period of really intense societal division, unrest,
Yeah.
and then their early adulthood is smack bang in the middle of a global pandemic that just threw existing inequalities into really sharp relief.
Absolutely exposed so much.
And hanging over all of it, these huge, tangible threats, climate change, economic worries,
Well,
it's a potent mix.
it really is. And Jessica Taft, she's at UC Santa Cruz, she makes a point about this heightened sense of crisis being just crucial for understanding Gen Z.
How so?
She argues that for this generation, things like climate change, massive inequality, even the rise of, authoritarianism, they feel like existential threats.
Right.
In a way, previous generations maybe didn't experience with quite the same global immediacy. And that perspective, it just fundamentally shapes their worldview and how central activism becomes for them.
Okay, now here's where it gets really interesting, thinking about how they experience all this. The role of technology, it's just pervasive.
Totally. Constant access.
Gen Z hasn't known a world without constant access to news, and maybe even more importantly, user-generated content, right?
Yeah.
Smartphones, social media.
All the time.
We're talking Instagram, TikTok, YouTube. And it's fascinating. There's data showing these are now the primary news sources for UK teens.
Wow. That's a huge shift from, say, print or scheduled TV news.
Massive shift from how older generations got their information. And you have to wonder how that constant stream, that fire hose of information, shapes their understanding.
Oh, it completely reshapes it. This constant connectivity, it creates this feeling of being perpetually aware of society's problems.
Hard to switch off.
Exactly. As the BBC article points out, it's much harder to just look away when it's constantly popping up on your devices. But instead of leading to apathy, which you might expect,
Yeah.
it actually seems to be galvanizing a lot of them, pushing them to act. Driven, like you mentioned David Hogg saying, it's not always about hope.
Right, that quote, "I'm not powered by hope. I'm powered by the fact I have no other choice."
Yeah, that captures that sense of urgent necessity so well.
And it seems like that urgency is translating into just, well, more people getting involved and starting younger, too.
The numbers definitely point that way. Edelman's research, for instance, found that 70% of Gen Z say they're involved in some social or political cause.
70%, that's huge.
It is. Now, that involvement takes different forms. Not everyone calls themselves an activist, but they are engaging through how they spend money, where they choose to work, even boycotting things.
Right, the boycotts, they seem more likely to do that.
Statistically, yes.
Hmm.
More likely than older generations to boycott products, companies, even countries based on their values. And work. Huge priority. Most want to work for companies that align with their values. Only about 1 in 5 would take a job at a company that doesn't share their values.
Wow, that really says something about their priorities, doesn't it?
It really does. It shows a clear shift.
And alongside this, it seems there's maybe a growing skepticism towards the traditional political systems.
Yeah, that comes through in the research, too. Data from the University of Cambridge points to lower trust in democratic politics among 18 to 34-year-olds.
And economic factors played a big role there.
Especially in developed countries, yes. Economic exclusion seems to be a key driver. And then there's research from the LSE suggesting that living through big crises, like the pandemic, during those formative young adult years, that can actually lead to long-term negative views about government, about elections.
So, okay, if there's less faith in the traditional routes, where are they putting that energy, that desire for change?
That's the crucial question. And one perspective from Orkun Saka is that this disillusionment doesn't necessarily mean apathy.
Okay.
It can actually lead to more engagement in what he calls alternative democratic means.
Like protests and petitions.
Exactly. Demonstrations, protests, boycotts, online petitions. He sees it as a shift in way they believe they can actually make a difference.
And they're finding that impact much earlier. Greta Thunberg is the obvious example, isn't she? Starting that solo protest at 15.
Such a powerful image. And Subir Sinha at SOS University, he thinks that sparked a huge domino effect. Provided young people with a role model who felt, well, relatable, authentic. He calls it post-celebrity activism.
Post-celebrity, meaning she wasn't like a traditional famous person.
Exactly. Her perceived ordinariness, her genuine concern, that actually amplified her message. It made activism feel more accessible, maybe less about some charismatic leader on a stage, and more about a peer just speaking truth.
That makes sense. And she's not the only one starting young.
Not at all. We see others gaining recognition even younger, like Lisapriya Kangojam campaigning against plastic pollution from age 10.
Yeah, and it's incredible.
It is. And as Sinha points out, for this generation, climate change isn't some abstract future problem.
No, it's here and now.
Right. With the wildfires, the floods, the extreme heat, it's visible. For some, there's this tangible feeling of impending apocalypse, and that just fuels this early, very vocal participation.
So technology isn't just informing them, it's also this absolutely essential tool for amplifying their voices, for organizing action.
Indispensable. They're digital natives, totally comfortable expressing their civic identities online.
Like in their Instagram bios or joining Discord groups.
Precisely. It's like the online world gives them a sense of agency, a platform that maybe they don't feel they have in more traditional civic spaces.
That's a really key insight. There was a study, UK Safer Internet Center, I think.
Yeah, that one found a lot of young people feel the internet inspires them to act on issues they care about, and crucially, makes them feel their voices actually matter.
That feeling of mattering is huge.
It is. And this ease of just broadcasting messages, building networks without needing traditional media gatekeepers, it's revolutionary.
Think about the speed and impact of movements like #MeToo or #BlackLivesMatter.
Exactly. Or just the sheer variety of digital activism now. Impactful TikTok videos, podcasts, even hacktivism using digital skills for a cause.
Subir Sinha makes that striking comparison, doesn't he? About having to physically fax letters back in the 90s.
Right. Faxing. The speed and global reach Gen Z has for organizing today. It's just a completely different universe.
And Elijah Mackenzie Jackson, he sees his social media as his own personal press tool.
Yeah, exactly. Allows him to tell his own story, connect directly with people globally. And this feeds into that whole glocal idea.
Global and local.
Right. Operating simultaneously on a global level through online networks, but also driving local on-the-ground action. The school strike for climate is a perfect example.
Online organizing fuels offline protest.
Exactly. And those networks reinforce each other, ultimately boosting global awareness about climate change. You also see people like Nadine Kali in Lebanon using various platforms really effectively to document and amplify her humanitarian work.
It feels like for so many in Gen Z, activism isn't just something they do anymore. It's becoming really tangled up with who they are.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. The lines between personal and public or personal and professional, they seem much blurrier for these young activists. Technology probably plays a role there too.
You mentioned Nadine Kali again.
Right. Her personal story, her passion, it's completely woven into her nonprofit work, her UN role. It's all connected.
And for Elijah Mackenzie Jackson, you said activism is like a community.
He described it like that. Yeah, a
Right.
community, a network, almost like family.
Right.
When you have that deeper personal investment, it probably makes you more committed, more resilient for the long haul.
And does research back that up? That early, deep engagement leads to longer commitment.
Well, Jessica Taft points to research on the 60s generation. It suggests that the common idea that young radicals just automatically become conservative as they age, it's not really borne out by the evidence.
Interesting.
Especially for those who were really deeply involved in movements when they were young, their core political beliefs tend to stay pretty consistent. So, yeah, it's entirely possible this commitment we're seeing from Gen Z could have really significant, long-lasting effects on society.
And Sabir Sinkai adds that point about older generations needing to, well, listen up, right?
Yeah, basically, to actively listen and make space for the ideas coming from young people. He argues that's crucial if radical progressive movements are going to survive and evolve.
It's interesting, too. Could the very technology Gen Z uses so well actually help bridge gaps between generations?
Possibly. By creating more shared online spaces, maybe for dialogue, for exchange, it could potentially narrow some ideological divides. You never know.
And there's even evidence of a trickle-up effect, isn't there?
Yeah, that's fascinating. Globally, over half the people surveyed believe teenagers and college-age kids are genuinely influencing how change happens.
Right.
And this influence is shaping how older generations engage too, affecting how boomers, Gen X, support causes.
Right. It really feels like Gen Z, with the tools they have and just their sheer willingness to speak out, they could genuinely be the loudest, maybe the most impactful generation of activists we've ever seen.
It's certainly possible. And as Elijah Mackenzie Jackson points out, especially after the disruption of the pandemic, there's this need to kind of remobilize, to reconnect people with their passions.
Because that personal connection is key.
That's what empowers your voice, he believes. Because ultimately, everyone has a voice and everyone can contribute to shaping things.
So bringing our deep dive toward a close, it
Yeah.
seems pretty clear. Gen Z's activism, it's different in some key ways.
Definitely. Starting early, for one.
Yeah, often starts young, shows a really deep, sustained commitment. It relies heavily on technology for mobilizing and amplifying.
In ways we just haven't seen before.
Right. And for many, it's becoming really woven into their personal identity.
And you can already see their influence. This isn't just, a fleeting trend. The way Gen Z engages, it really does have the potential for significant long-term impact on our societies, on how we tackle the big challenges.
Which leaves us with a final thought for you listening in. As you've heard about how this constant connectivity, this exposure to global issues, shapes Gen Z's world,
Yeah.
maybe take a moment to consider how it affects your own perspective. Are there lessons we can all learn, maybe, from their proactive approach to making their voices heard? Regardless of our own generation or how engaged we currently feel, something to think about.